The bar was very high when the way that Sam approached this Torah portion. He set important questions. What is justice? Is what we read in the Torah has a literal meaning? And I tried to develop these thoughts as well. For the second time, we celebrate these days under physical conditions unprecedented in the lifetime of even the oldest among us, if ever, conditions which have darkened the world, with terrors untold, and laid upon human hearts unmeasured burdens of anxiety and grief. It sounds too familiar. Indeed, approximately 2 years ago, we started to hear the news about the virus that by now we all know too well. Although these words sound relevant and familiar to all of us, they are not about COVID-19 pandemic. Rabbi Israel Matak said these words at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue on Thursday, the 9th of September, 1915. It was the second Rosh Hashanah after the beginning of the First World War. A year earlier, during Rosh Hashanah 1914, just a few months after the war was declared, Matak reflected on the effect that it had on humanity. Many slow achievements of human civilization, not alone in physical institutions, but in moral ideas, are consumed by it as paper in fire. Ideals of social justice, universal peace, and the improvement of man have in their realization been further removed from us. The result of centuries of human effort in civilization are threatened with complete destruction. This is what the beginning of war can feel like, or at least felt like to Rabbi Matak, the first rabbi of this community. Matak said that it undermined the very core of human morality, and yet we know that people can start wars to achieve justice, to protect innocent people, to stop the great evil forces. The war can aim to prevent destruction. In other words, a war can start to achieve peace. But in reality, there is no winner in a war. The results of centuries of human effort in civilizations are threatened with complete destruction. Today, more than a century after Rabbi Matak read these words, 77 years since the liberation of the concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz and at the end of the Second World War and the end of Holocaust, the world is seriously speaking about war again. They say that it might be the best news for coronavirus, though. Now, when we're seriously speaking about a possible war in Eastern Europe, we suddenly begin to realize that perhaps spending a few months at home in lockdown and wearing masks in public places is not too bad after all. Well, I find myself torn and divided inside. As many of you know, I was born and spent most of my life in Russia. My parents still live there. I also have close relatives and many friends in Ukraine. And I live here in London, in the West. I follow the news in both Russian and English. It is not the first time different countries have conflicting interests and present their story in a very different way. But what I find surprising is the frequency and ease with which the possibility of war casually mentioned in the news today. In that Rosh Hashanah sermon from the 9th of September 1915, Israel Matak reflected on the purpose of the First World War. He said, "In the minds of many, a country's dominion may stand for nothing more than the extended opportunities for trade, protection in various quarters of the globe, and satisfactory opportunities for them born with it to progress in industry or other material interest. If that were all nationality stood for, then this war was a horrible and inexpiable crime, not only for the nations that brought it on, but for all the nations that partake in it. If the struggle were for trade interest, colonial possessions, or mere physical power, then every drop of blood split in it were an internal cry of condemnation, and every sacrifice made but as a sacrifice to unheeding idols. Well, thank God, the current conflict has not come to bloodshed. However, the concentration of troops and weaponry in one place, in one region, can become the Chekhov's rifle. When there are so many disagreements and the stories we tell to ourselves are so different, when there is a profound misunderstanding and unwillingness to compromise from both sides, there is a danger that one day tensions of diplomacy will burst into a real war. A geopolitical crisis like this forces us to ask important questions. What is that this conflict represents? Is there anything in this world that can justify a real-life physical fight? Is it the best expression of justice to respond to a physical threat of weapons and troops with more weapons and troops? This week's Torah portion speaks to us and outlines principles of justice. At first glance, the law seems straightforward. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, food for food, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And before that it says life for life. Early in Jewish intellectual history, Torah scholars concluded that it is impossible to implement these principles in practice. Impossible. Maimonides articulated this in the following way. This Torah statement doesn't mean that we should physically injure the perpetrator, but that the perpetrator is deserving of losing his limb and must therefore pay financial restitution. Another way to understand this verse is to consider the time and place it was written. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi from the 18th century or before the Common Era explicitly legislated that the eye of a noble was a much greater value than the eye of a farmer. In contrast, the Torah law here says that every person's eye is as valuable as anyone else's. The eye of a president is worth no more than the eye of a soldier. Therefore, the Torah law, eye for an eye, is a very simple expression of human equality. I believe that this is the principle of equality that we should try to apply today. When the world's leaders divide people and use human lives and deadly weapons as a political tool, we must oppose it. When the world's leaders are too proud to compromise, we must stop for a moment and remind ourselves that human life is more important than anything else. When individuality prevails over humanity, when the pursuit of power and influence overrides the basic safety and well-being of people, when the songs of blind patriotism and nationalism sound louder than songs of peace and love, our prophets remind us, "Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." It is not only justice that the prophet demands, not formality, but righteousness too. It is not enough to be right. It is acting with integrity, compassion, and kindness that makes the nation great. In the middle of the war, Israel Matek delivered another sermon entitled "The Challenge to Religion in War." In it, he reminded people of the most basic values that we all share, regardless of what side we take in the conflict. He said, "Do we not even now," notice the date, 2.5 years in the war, "do we not even now pray with all our hearts for comfort and strength to be given to the suffering of all nations? Yes, not even the loud din of the battlefield can silence the call of one human heart to another. Shot and shell cannot break the cords of sympathy that bind together aching hearts. Humanity is one." I would like to conclude my thoughts for today, not with the words of comfort or expression of hope. I think we can hear them and we can think, but repeat the words of the Siddur Lev Chadash and repeat these words. Teach us, O God, to be ourselves because of and in spite of our past and present circumstances. Teach us to be our best selves because of our abilities and in spite of our weaknesses. Teach us to be not what others expect of us, but what you expect of us, and what we at our best expect of ourselves. Teach us to be what only we can be, to contribute our own song to the great concert of your world, where none behave like human beings, behave like a human being.